inviting myself and our panel here today. But before we get started, a little bit, you've been hearing from the panelists a little bit, but a quick show of hands. How many of you are business owners or IT from the business community? How many of you are technology vendors or service providers? Good. Academia? And how about attorneys on, from a law standpoint, representing? Well, good. We don't have too many attorneys. So we're in good shape there. So let me ask another quick question. How many of you had a data breach or data loss incident? Okay, we see a few. I guess everyone else just doesn't know that it's happening yet. So, but we're going to just kind of go through here. So we have a great panel here of really first responders, and you've been hearing the threats and kind of, everyone is like, oh my God, we should go offline here. I don't want to really have that negative of a tone here. I think we actually have some positive news here, and I think some really good prescriptive advice that this panel will share with you. So starting with Andreas, maybe just a quick, share what your role is, your title, rank, your social security number and such, and then we'll go into some of the other.
It is working. Okay, great. There we go. My name is Andreas Kaltsunis. I'm a special agent with the Defense Criminal Investigative Service, which is the law enforcement arm of the Department of Defense Inspector General's Office. I'm currently a member of our National Cyber Field Office, which is based out of Virginia, but we have people placed throughout the United States. And I'm currently also co-located with the FBI's Cyber Task Force here in Seattle. Focus for me that's relevant for you guys would be intrusion investigations involving Department of Defense, anything that might touch the Department of Defense, which includes contractors in the defense industrial base, cleared defense contractors. That is essentially what I'm focusing on now, and I'll pass it on to Tim.
Good morning. My name is Timothy Wallach. I'm a supervisory special agent with the FBI. I currently lead the FBI Cyber Task Force in the Seattle division of the FBI. We have 56 field offices. Seattle is one of them. We cover the entire state of Washington. I get to work with great people like Andreas, who are from partner agencies, as well as other folks within the FBI. Our task force is made up of special agents, intelligence analysts, forensic examiners, computer scientists, other administrative positions. We have about 25 people on our team.
On now? Great. I'll start again. My name's Andrew Friedman. I'm the chief of something called the Complex Crimes Unit in the U.S. Attorney's Office in Seattle. The U.S. Attorney's Office is basically the office that prosecutes federal crimes. And the Complex Crimes Unit, one of the kinds of crimes we work on is cybercrime. So we work with FBI and DCIS, other investigative agencies that are investigating cyber intrusions, support those intrusions by helping get legal process to get records that are useful in the investigations, and then when we're successful in solving those, or when the agents are successful in solving those, we're the group that brings prosecutions, takes people to court, charges them if we can get them, and hopefully puts them in jail for a while.
Great. And I guess I'm Craig Spiesel, the executive director of the Online Trust Alliance, which is based in Bellevue, but we're a global organization that works on developing best practices, legislation, benchmark reporting, to protect security and privacy. And someone asked about trust before, and I think a key part of that, it's not just security, but it's also privacy, how you're using that data. I do want to kind of touch on a few things here. I asked a question before about who's had a breach and who hasn't. The reality is, if you're collecting data, you have data that's covered in some jurisdictions, some requirements, you have some form of PII, and you will have an incident. And Mark made a comment about, if you aren't dealing with this, you'll be out of business. And I use this expression, the business shock. And it's not just the hard cost, but the business interruption that it can cause and paralyze an organization. I've seen deals of acquisitions fall through at the last moment. So the impact in this, it's not just immediate, but there's huge amounts in partnership and business partners and such. There's also some data being shared, and the Verizon report's a great report, a very small sample. We looked at over 1,400 incidents, and I think one of the points, and the gentleman over there asked about, well, how can I get my CEO to invest? And it's not really necessarily investing in dollars, but time and management. And a lot of the points in the Verizon report and this study that we did, it's about configuration. It's the simple things that aren't being done. And almost 90 to 95%, depending upon the study, shows that if you had done the simple things, configured your servers correctly, you would have been able to block the attempt. So it's not just about hard dollars, it's about doing the simple things first. And just for let you know, again, obviously a day doesn't go by with breaches, and you're going to have handouts, or I think they're going to provide you electronic copies of these. But again, the amount and magnitude of the breaches that you're hearing about. So key areas there. So the problem is lack of planning. And this is the problem that we deal with, and Tim has been great with working with us. We've developed a data breach response plan. And it's people who just are not prepared whatsoever, and they have an incident occur and they have no idea who to turn to, and they don't know who to contact in law enforcement and such. So we're going to touch on some of that stuff here, but the reality is, if you don't have a good plan in place, if you don't have processes in place, you don't have first responders, things will fall apart very quickly. So at the end of the day, it will happen to you, and who are you going to call? And hopefully you're going to call one of these guys, but you're not going to call during the incident. You're going to have called them before, and you're going to have some plans in place. So let's have that discussion a little bit. I'm going to kind of now move to the moderator role here. Maybe one of the... Okay, great. So lots of issues, and everyone had a lot of concerns here. So we're dealing with a breach. What happens? So, who do they call? One of the first questions is, who do you call? And so maybe, from your own perspective, and when should that call occur?
Ghostbusters? Who are you going to call?
That was the previous slide, yeah.
Well, what we'd like to say in at least the federal government circles that work or investigate cyber breaches and intrusions is a call to one is a call to all. There's several agencies, multiple agencies across the U.S. government that investigate and collect intelligence in this space. And it's the FBI is one of the primary ones. The U.S. Secret Service is a primary. Department of Homeland Security has responsibilities. So my recommendation is establish a relationship with one or all of us in your local field office, in your region, with DCIS. Multiple agencies, establish that relationship ahead of time, and we will work it out on the back end in terms of who has jurisdiction, who should be investigating the actual breach. One other thing is there are organizations out there, and I always have to do this, like InfraGard. It's a public-private partnership the FBI hosts. There's a chapter in the state of Washington. Become a member of those types of organizations, the ISACs that was mentioned earlier. Participate in those ISAC entities, because you will build relationships through those avenues.
Let me ask another. So should they only contact you when they've successfully taken data, or what about if I just notice a DDoS attack or something? Do you want that threat intel, and who would I go to with that?
The answer is, we definitely, we always want more information. The concern is that we get so much that we're overwhelmed by it, obviously, and so, but the short answer is we don't want to know just about successful cases. Now, we don't necessarily want to hear, and we're not going to come out for every time you get an email from a Nigerian prince that needs help moving his money out of the company or the country. But if we get more specific and we look at something that is a problem now, which is spear phishing directed at specific individuals at an organization, even if those are not successful, that there is something special, I think, about a attacker who has taken the time to research a organization or an individual enough to create what appears to be a good, legitimate, well-written, spear phishing attempt to try and get into that organization. And even if you've been successful in, because it didn't have a digital signature or whatever it is, the person was just really on top of it and didn't, fall for the lure. Even though you didn't suffer a loss and there wasn't actually an incident from it, I would certainly be very interested in hearing about a, very good-looking, potentially successful spear phishing campaign against someone in your organization. So that, for me, is sort of, where the line is. And so, again, the short answer is we do want to hear about attempts as well that you're successful in thwarting, because there could be a lot of great intelligence to get from it, and there may be another company down the street that wasn't quite as savvy as your individual, or next week it's going to be someone at your company who's not quite as savvy, and they were next on the list for the next spear phishing, and maybe we can, do something to head that off. Absolutely, I apologize. Essentially, it's an attempt to it's a social engineering attempt, essentially, where an attacker wants to compromise a network or a system, and so they generate an email that appears to be from either a colleague, a coworker, either internally in the company, from someone that they know or they trust. They then send the email with some sort of payload attached to it that the person might not otherwise open, but because they think it's from a trusted individual, they will then open that, and results in a compromise on the system that they may not be aware is even happening. And so we are seeing this again in these advanced threats where they will the attacker will actually research the person, their contacts, the structure of the company. If you put a hierarchy online, here's our, chain of command in the company. They can go in and do that, maybe find out who the director of HR is and send out some HR-related email. I mean, I joked about these Nigerian scams earlier. They're often poorly worded, and you can identify the errors in English. It's a little too proper sometimes, it's just not right. But the well-written ones, the well-done ones, they're well-written and they fool people.
Do you want to add to that a little bit?
Yeah, and you're generally not going to call the U.S. Attorney's Office or a prosecutor immediately. You will get faster help from the FBI, DCIS, and investigative agency. We do work with victim companies, but it tends to be down the line in conjunction with agents if a case has been solved, if there is a prosecution going to be brought, something like that. So we're not quite first responders. We're I don't know what a second responder is. We're probably second responders.
Yeah, so just to touch base on that, the spear phishing, the criminals are really becoming very good marketers, becoming more and more precise. They're going to LinkedIn, they're finding where you went. We saw they go to employees of a company. They know that Fidelity manages their 401k program. They know Fidelity sends out that statement on the first day of the next quarter. So it's all about relevancy, and you're quick on there. Now, the good news is there's things that you guys can do, and we're going to touch on some best practices to block those mails. But, Target's a good example. It was a spear phishing exploit that targeted a vendor, their HVAC vendor, that got compromised. And so, again, an employee opened a mail that was malicious there. You talk about, jurisdiction, and so, we have some people from the state speaking, so we have law enforcement reporting. What about other regulatory, what are my other responsibilities? Do I have to report to the state of Washington? No one wants to touch that one?
I'll hit it just a little bit. I mean, obviously, that there's a morass of these breach notification laws that are out there right now, and there's not anything consistent nationwide at this point. There's a push to try and do something like that, but right now there's not. Most states have some sort of breach notification laws. Washington does, obviously, and I'm not going to, we don't have time to get into a lot of the specifics of it here. I assume if you guys need to know about it, you know what it says, but those are separate from contacting us, essentially. Those are rules which, govern your responsibility to notify victims of loss of, usually it's PII. There are a whole host of other cases, though, where PII might not be involved, where it could be, let's say, an economic espionage case where they're trying to steal trade secrets from your company, trying to get, other intellectual property. That's not going to trigger any sort of breach notification laws typically, but we would absolutely still be interested in knowing about it and with working with you on it. Even though it's not a PII breach.
Yeah. To clarify, what I was trying to push out there is, by notifying law enforcement, that does not constitute notification to regulatory authorities. And so there's 3 levels of notification typically. There's 46 different states that require some form of notification. Their definition of PII is different, and it's not where you have a nexus. It's where that consumer resides. So you have to, as a business here, be thinking about that. The second thing is, then depending upon their regulations, there may be a notification to the impacted user, typically a consumer there. So I just want to raise it. We're not going to answer that question, but it is a whole set of reporting requirements. Did you?
And I was just going to say, this is another reason that you want to have a plan in place. You want to have thought up front about, if PII is stolen from me, what am I going to do? If other types of information are stolen, what am I going to do? Because those are hard questions to answer right after a breach happens. If it's part of the plan, which should also include contacting law enforcement, you'll have a better idea how to deal with it if or when it happens.
I just want to comment that they're not mutually exclusive notifications. We do work very well with the regulatory agencies and the victim companies when we are conducting an investigation, and we do not disclose your compromise to the press or to your competitors. So our preference is you notify us early. Andreas touched on some intelligence. We want to know about your compromises, even though they may not seem to be important to you. They may correlate with other investigations we have. The FBI is a domestic intelligence agency. We collect intelligence to try and prevent some of these crimes from happening. And in the cyberspace, that is one area that is really critical for us to know what is happening to companies like yours, other government agencies, academic institutions, because the actors are targeting specific institutions and companies for specific reasons, and we correlate that to other intelligence campaigns we have and investigations.
We talked about reputational harm, and I do want to probe a little bit more, but because there is a fear. I speak to a lot of businesses, and it's like, well, if they share too early, they don't have all the information, and then they're being accused of misinformation. And we know sometimes it's uncovering one rock and rolling one over and finding other things. So businesses have that reluctance, so they want to do that due diligence first. So how do you address that issue? Because if they wait 6 months for their investigation and then they turn that over, that doesn't help law enforcement necessarily. So any thoughts on that challenge? Not trying to put you in the hot spot, Tim.
Getting back to my last comment, it's not a mutually exclusive situation where if you have a breach, you might be working with an incident response company. We partner with those entities. When your data is passed to us, it obviously requires approval within the company, generally from the C-suite or the general counsel's office. Your incident response company, if that's who you're working with, or if you're a small business and you are doing it internally, we also have resources that we can help with some forensics. We don't provide mitigation, but we can give guidance on where you might seek mitigation and incident response. And Andreas, actually, that's part of his background, so he could speak to that too.
So this is probably, for me at least, one of the most important messages I could get out here today is, why is it so important for you to call us sooner than later and not wait until 3 months has passed? One of the first issues is that, as you know, a lot of this information and data is very ephemeral and it's going to disappear very quickly. We have tools available to us to conduct our investigations, which aren't available to a private incident response firm. We have legal process that we can use to, trace back where something might be coming from, but our window for doing that is often closed very quickly. And we can get a list of IP addresses where something might be coming from, but if we get it 6 months later, our ability to do something with that information becomes very limited, whereas if we have it very early on, we might be able to actually do something with it. We might even be able to, find the activity while it's still happening from that IP address and do some other things and figure out who else is being targeted and what else is going on. And so that's the first thing, is that there's just a loss of information that's going to occur over time that we can never get back. And so I would encourage you to, contact us initially. The second issue is that the specific value that we add to an incident response is the collection of information that is both relevant to our investigation and that is collected in a way that actually can be useful and with the least amount of difficulty in a criminal prosecution if it's able to go there at some point in the future. Your IT staff may be a fantastic IT staff. Amber Alert, what is that? But they don't necessarily have the complete training in how to collect something, maintain a proper chain of custody, and collect it in a way that is going to be useful and admissible in a court later on. And so that's something that we can add to it. And so there are some real benefits to getting that information to us earlier rather than later.
What about the limitations when you get involved? And you start to touch on forensics, but as you get in, start to kind of look at information and you find what a company isn't keeping and such, that limits your ability. Do you have some advice? What 2 or 3 things that you should be thinking about, like your logs and different things? Any perspectives on lack of information that you aren't able? You kind of limit on what you're able to do because the company hadn't done something in advance.
Well, I mean, obviously, we'd love to have a full year of packet captures for, but, that's not realistic, right? So, I mean, there's the best practices that are out there. I mean, there should be obviously basic logging that's on systems that's preferably being, remotely, sent to some other location so it can be erased during the attack. I mean, I'm not going to be able to go through all the best practices here, but we definitely want those logs. We want to be able to get the IP addresses of where things are coming in from, see the activity a little bit before, a little bit after, and one of the problems we often run into is that we will be limited by you may have a good proxy set up, but then it makes it very difficult for us to get back to figure out where something actually came from, and organizations have difficulties doing that sometimes. So being able to quickly identify not only that there was an attack on the network somewhere, but being able to point us to a specific machine that we can get back to and do something with it is useful for us.
I think one of the things that we've learned, the time to have someone from a forensics time to come in isn't when you have the event. It's beforehand to do an assessment. And as much as, we may be, CIOs, CSOs who have all the certifications, having an outsider come in and look at this is really a good investment before anything, to make sure those logs are set correctly, that you are capturing it and it's being captured remotely. So I think that's one thing of really actionable advice. I want to get back in one of the questions that we were asked as we were planning here, but do these cases ever bring anyone into an orange jumpsuit? Do we really, maybe can?
Yeah, I mean there's some cases that are easy to solve and some that are harder to solve. So traditional crime, arson is incredibly hard to solve. Cybercrime cases are probably in the harder to solve category, but we do succeed in doing it. There are problems. I mean, sometimes the person you figure out is responsible is in Eastern Europe or somewhere it's hard to get them back from. Sometimes they're in the U.S. And so we've got a number of cases that we've prosecuted in this jurisdiction over the last few years, and some of them fairly significant. There's a Russian hacker, a fellow named Roman Seleznev, who's been appearing in the paper a number of times recently. He was probably one of the biggest carders. It's someone sort of involved in stealing credit cards and reselling them responsible for stealing millions of credit cards. Good investigative work by Secret Service helped figure out what his identity was, and then he made the mistake of traveling abroad. One thing is, when people make a lot of money illegally and live in Russia, they start to think they'd like to be some other places. He went to the Maldives, which is, I hadn't realized it immediately, but it's a beautiful island thousands of miles south of India. If you look on the internet at the address, the hotel that he was staying at, remarkably beautiful place. But they were also willing to cooperate with U.S. law enforcement and hand him over to the custody of U.S. law enforcement. And so he's here being prosecuted now. There have been other cases. There was something called the Conficker virus a few years ago. It was basically scareware. They basically put malware on people's computer and said it advertised a program that would remove the malware and fix your computer, solve the problems it was having. So people would spend, I think it was $79 to buy the virus protection to solve the virus that had actually already been planted. And when you bought that, it wasn't a perfect cure. In fact, it put other malware in your computer that exposed you to other problems. Law enforcement, in that case I think it was FBI primarily in our office, were able to take down servers across the world in 22 countries that were basically responsible for that scheme, to charge a number of people. Some of them have been brought into U.S. court, prosecuted and sentenced. There are arrest warrants out for others. So not always, but we do succeed, and there are cases around the country succeeding, and it's useful in terms of preventing future attacks, deterring others from going into this line of work. So
Tim, maybe you can touch on a little bit. You have some great international experience. What are the limitations, or what are the successes, I should say, and of how we can bring these people back through treaties and such? Touch on that.
So the U.S. government has treaties with various countries on extradition, on information exchange. One of the main ones is called Mutual Legal Assistance treaties, which we're bound by the treaty to cooperate with that country and fulfill legal process. So most of the countries that we deal with now have these MLAT treaties. Unfortunately, they can be a time-consuming process. However, they do work, and it allows us to have them action investigative steps on our behalf, and vice versa. They can ask that of us as well. There's also the police, what we call police-to-police sharing. We have legal attaché offices throughout the world, FBI legal attaché offices, where we have agents who work in embassies who interact with the host country law enforcement and security services on exchanging information on that level. And that's a very quick process where we can further our investigation through that process. The Secret Service also has attachés abroad, as well as Homeland Security. So we leverage those contacts, and it's a lot like state and local and federal contacts that we have here in the U.S.
2 points I was going to mention is a good example of threat intel is they weren't maybe successful, but you're getting IP addresses and you're following the breadcrumbs, and then, like you said, you know that the person now is in a different country, and so it may not be next week, but it might be next year or a few years later there. There was a question earlier someone had made. They said, geez, they just read about first time corporations have cooperated and banded together. And I think that's the first time that they all spent the PR efforts to get that in the news. Many of us have been working in these areas for several years, botnet takedowns, DDoS attacks, working with law enforcement. So there's been a lot more public-private collaboration beyond the scenes. And by design, those companies typically don't want to get out there and make too much publicity. But maybe some comments on, those successes that you've been involved in, or...
Well, there is ongoing cooperation on some of these cyber intrusions, botnet type initiatives. Microsoft is a big player in that field. Their philosophy is they want to protect their customer. Microsoft owns probably 90%, I think that's the latest figure, 91 or 92% of the market share for operating systems. So their systems tend to be targeted just because they have a large market share. Symantec also, so there is a level of cooperation, public-private cooperation. As Craig mentioned, it's not always publicized, but we do cooperate on various operations. There was a recent one in the last couple of years, was called Operation Clean Slate, where we partnered with multiple private sector companies to take down some bad actors, and the private companies were able to try and disinfect or clean the infected computers. So we do see that cooperation.
Yeah, we could talk at the break, but there's a lot of efforts on the legislative side to remove some barriers in that. And there's a Senate hearing this summer with Microsoft Symantec, the FBI, the Bureau, I believe your boss's boss and such, and myself. And we talked about that, and again, to promote more of that activity. So those are really important things for us to be thinking about. I want to talk about forensics. Someone last night at the reception was saying, oh yeah, they love CSI and they're really getting some great ideas. And I guess one of my comments to him was, well, don't even thinking about it. Leave that to the professionals. So, and maybe some of the missteps and such there. So if you can see the slide there, so copyright infringement, I apologize here, but I think it's important that we think about some of these things.
Well, when I showed up here, I don't know if he's here or not, but the first question I get when I say I work for the Defense Criminal Investigative Service is, oh, is that like NCIS? And I love that show. And then the third comment is it really anything like that? Everything that happens on these shows, obviously, there's some nugget of truth to all of it, but typically what they do in 5 minutes takes us 5 days. And that's a lot of times, the biggest difference. They want to find out where someone is, and so they, want to track. Exactly, they're more efficient, i.e., illegal. If we want to track someone's cell phone, there's things we have to do in order to do it legally. We don't just hop on our computer at our desk and start tracking their cell phone, which is what they do on the TV shows. And so it takes time, and I'm not complaining. There's good reasons why those barriers are there, but it has created in some people a misperception into how quickly we can accomplish something. And so understand that when we take some of those steps, with the exception of cases where it's literally like we think there's a bomb on the truck or there's a kidnapped person in the trunk of that car, they do take a little bit more time. And this really does go back to the issue of getting the information to us sooner rather than later, because we do have to go through legal process to get most of the information that we get and to track back any of the investigations that we do, and those all take time. And it doesn't matter if we're getting a subpoena, a search warrant, or some other tool in another type of investigation, but they take sometimes too long, frankly, in my opinion, but we could, I'm sure, have a huge argument about that all day. But that's the takeaway, I think, is that it happens a lot slower than.
So another takeaway for you is, don't call me on a weekend saying we have it. Who do you recommend that we call to do forensics for you? That's not the time to have the conversation. You should have that conversation, retain a company, have them come in beforehand, have that relationship. Tim didn't really mention it. You should have the relationship with the Bureau or the service beforehand. You shouldn't be trying at the last minute there. And then also a small, perhaps a bit of legal advice is you may want to consider having your law firm retain that forensics firm, because that provides some protection of that data and such if you are sued. So there are some processes there. So I'm not trying to practice law here, but you should consider that if you need to have forensics. That is law firms, more and more of them are retaining on your behalf the forensics firm. So,
and I just want to also touch on that. We do have obviously forensic technical capabilities, internally within our agencies. I've been doing forensics for since 2004, been all the NCASE access data training, et cetera, and all the network intrusion trainings with DoD and on. And so there is some value that we can add in coming in and helping you, and it's not so much helping you, it's just collecting the information that we need in order to do the investigation. We're not going to, again, replace either your internal IT department or a remediation firm that you need to hire. We're going to work with them. there, and again, I don't want to set the expectation that we're going to be, driving out in 30 minutes for, every incident that comes up. But in the right situation, that may be something that we want to do, is actually come out. There may actually be a situation too where we want to try and set up some sort of live monitoring of what activity is going on your network. That's not something we're going to do without your permission. I want to make very clear that you never will lose control of your networks and your data and the PR aspect of this by calling us, but we can talk about the possibility in the right cases of actually setting up some sort of network tap and actually monitoring activity that's going on rather than immediately shutting down, which I guarantee is going to be the immediate go-to response from most of your internal IT folks. So there's some other opportunities that we offer.
Yeah. You actually touched on a really key point. How many of you ever go to Jimmy John's here? Well, Jimmy John's, they're headquartered in Illinois. They detected a breach. They reached out to the state attorney general and the FBI, and a decision was made not to go public on that for almost 90 days. And the reason was, so that's a good example of collaboration there. It was because they wanted to track down the criminals. And so they hardened the point of sale at those compromised stores, but they were tracking additional information. So while the initial reaction is you want to shut everything down, there's from a law enforcement, that's a collaboration point. And it's also about trust, right? Because, and actually it was very interesting, Attorney General Madigan from Illinois actually defended. People say, well, why didn't Jimmy John's come out and disclose it earlier? And, that was a good example. That was in the best interest of everyone to do that. So there's, that's a whole point of working together, I think.
And at least the Washington breach notification law specifically written in there that as in response to a request from law enforcement that you may delay notification that is otherwise required under that statute. And that, I believe, is the only, exception for delaying notification, is you have to have a request from, someone that you're working with in the law enforcement community.
Let's see what, I kind of forgot what slides we have here. Oh, talking about breach legislation. It's frustrating right now. There's 46 different states. We've publicly been supported. We've worked on a few bills in Congress. Unfortunately, there's some very powerful trade organizations that want to have the bar set so low that it becomes meaningless, and they also don't want to provide state rights of enforcement. So we believe that there's a real need for have federal legislation that defines what a breach is, defines PII. We think businesses could actually gain a lot by that, but we also believe the states should have the right to enforce. And this is no different than SPAM or COPPA, Children's Protection federal acts here. So this came out last week, and I thought it was really relevant on there. Let's see. So I'm not sure where we are when we started on time here, because we kind of are way all over on the agenda here. So we've been talking about best practices. Tim, one of the other, you mentioned InfraGard earlier. You actually managed that there. Maybe a little more detail on how you can get involved and why businesses should get involved in the organization.
I think one of the main reasons to get involved, it's a networking opportunity for, particularly in the state of Washington, to be able to network with your peers. We just provide the forum. And so it's infragard.org, www.infragard.org. You can go onto the website. Is that up there?
We have the next slide. We'll get to that.
But again, it's an opportunity to develop a network that you may not already have. In various verticals as well, IT folks working in various verticals, and then other professionals working in various verticals. Also, they meet on a quarterly basis, and we try to have at each meeting a threat topic. Somebody from the FBI or another agency or private sector come in and talk about some of the emerging threats that we're seeing in cyberspace. And lastly, it's an opportunity for you to develop that relationship with the FBI up front. So when you do have a situation, a breach, or a threat of any kind, it could be completely outside of the cyberspace issue. You have that established channel to communicate with the FBI. One point I want to make is that Andreas mentioned the television. It's not like television with the FBI. We don't fly in our black helicopters and blue raid jackets with FBI all over them. We come into your office and meet very discreetly and have discreet discussions, particularly with companies that are sensitive about the breaches they've had. Oftentimes, we will reach out for you. We will be notified by another field office, another government agency, that your organization has been compromised. And so we will reach out for you, and you may get a call from, we tend to try and go to the general counsel's office first, because they're usually the gatekeepers to contact with the company. Our other avenue is with the IT folks. We contact you and say, we need to talk to you about something. We may not always give you the context of how we receive the information, but we try and give you as much information as we can to help you mitigate it and help us investigate it or collect intelligence. So expect that to happen, and it happens more and more with us. We call it victim notification. It is kind of the catchphrase we use.
Yeah, I think it gets back into the benefit of sharing threat intel. You may think it's just happening to you, but it may be happening to other people. One of the advantages of organizations such as InfraGard, which I happen to also be involved in, is that someone in aerospace may be seeing this, but maybe the next target is the pharma industry or other industries there. So the cyber criminals are agnostic. They just want to go where the money is in the data. So they're going to try, and they're going to compromise whatever supply chain they can have there. So these are some of the best practices or some of the recommendations that we want to have. We have some time for some questions here. I do want to, I added this slide at the last moment here. I'm not going to say who's getting the F grade here, but there's 3 organizations that is in this room that I just scanned their website that are highly vulnerable. And we talk about best practices, and whoops, skipped over there. The point of this is simple management administrative things here that needs to be done. There are simple tools that are available, and if I can do it from here, the cyber criminals. So if I can identify that vulnerability that you haven't patched your server and there's a known exploit and you're a target, it's game over. So it's not about spending money. It's not convincing your board to spend more money. There are tools up there. So I created a few things up there. Agnes mentioned about email and spoofing and forging. Email authentication is extremely important. And again, most of the speakers this morning their domains are not authenticated. They are ripe for email abuse. And that's a very important thing. And again, these are simple things you can do. You put in your DNS certain records that help receiving networks. So it's not about investment, but it helps protect your brand and your employees and your customers. So I don't want to belabor that, but there's lots of upside opportunities here. And then we have some resources here that everyone put together, but we have, I think, a few minutes. We've kind of run through here, and I believe you'll get an electronic copy of this deck here. But certainly want to take some questions from the audience. Hopefully we didn't scare you too much. This isn't, they're here to help. Go ahead, Mark.
So thanks, guys. And quick question. So Mandiant, I happen to know Kevin, when they came out and gave attribution for the first time publicly, it was great because they were stepping, the DOD and so forth, that probably had a lot of this information already, but they were able to speak in a non-classified world and say, we've done the homework, and here's Team 61398, or they live in Shanghai. We know who did this. It was the first time that it happened. Are you guys in a position where you can do things for attribution you haven't done yet and help us understand, in whatever way it works best for you, more about the attackers?
Make a quick comment. I think there's a change. Actually, I know there's a change going on back in Washington, D.C., the other Washington, right? About attribution. Director Comey was commented on what he said about the virtual parking lot. He also called the Chinese attackers drunken burglars who are going to come in and steal your vase and walk out the front door. So I think there is this wave of change back in Washington, D.C. that's going to open up some of the attribution to particular actor sets. Probably not on the collection, how we obtained it, but that's coming, and it's coming across the entire U.S. government.
I would just say that, overall, I think there is an effort to try and improve the ability to share information. I mean, it's always difficult when you're dealing in this world with classified information, and that's, where a lot of it comes from. But For those of you who aren't familiar with the report, I assume most of you are, but Mandiant essentially outed a bunch of Chinese state actors that were involved in cyber campaigns against U.S. interests. And there was, following that, the first indictment of a number of these individuals. And that was, I think, fair to say, a sea change in the way that, these things are dealt with. And, typically it's been, there's the criminal world and then there's the national security world, and the two, do not cross often. And I think there's an increased appetite both in law enforcement and at, various U.S. attorneys' offices to, acknowledge that a national security case also involves criminal activity, espionage typically, and that where there's appropriate cases, the criminal cases can be brought, that will be done, and that obviously, requires, additional release of information if we're going to bring a criminal case. So.
The other thing I would say is there's competing considerations. Most of the time you don't want to say that, hey, we have charged someone criminally who is overseas because they stopped leaving Russia, you can't get them. And so there's always an incentive for someone you think is going to travel, or you think you might be able to get down the line, to charge them and have a sealed indictment. And so I don't think I'm betraying any secrets to say our district and other districts have lots of sealed indictments out there for cyber criminals. There will be, I have nothing to do with the Mandiant case and that Chinese unit. I'm sure someone has made a calculation there that the national security benefit of saying these soldiers in this Chinese army unit have done this outweighs the value of hoping that one of them is going to, fly and take vacation in Paris, which probably wasn't going to happen. But so I think there are realms in which there's an idea of early disclosure, and for the others, people who've been charged and it's sealed, it becomes public as soon as you arrest them. But until that time, it's not disclosed.
To add to that, I think you're seeing more efforts of industry taking down those who may be enabling. So maybe not necessarily directly complicit, but complacent. So taking down hosts, taking down networks and such, and so putting more accountability. And so you're seeing more aggressive action. Clearly in August, there's Microsoft, took down thousands of domains. There were some false positives, so it can happen. But again, it does come back down to, I think, service providers have a higher degree of accountability, and I think what you're going to see more of them getting blocked and those type of actions being taken. So it's not just the responsibility of law enforcement. I think you're going to see technology providers getting more aggressive as well. We have time for one more, or we...
You may have covered this, and I just want to know. I'm a company, and I believe I've been breached, and I decide to go off the breach country guy. And obviously my first thrust is to stop it and get it cut off. But what are the actual odds that on the back end of that you will actually be able to both identify perpetrator and or get any remediation or anything out of it? What are the actual odds and what happens on the back end?
Let me repeat it. So let me repeat it just to make sure everyone heard. So I've had a breach, I've stopped it, I've gone to law enforcement, but what's the odds that A, you're going to be able to catch them, and what about any remediation to my financial losses?
Well, I'm glad you asked that question for our last one, because I want to make sure we leave with this point, which is, the odds, it's hard for me to answer right now because we don't get a lot of reports, and so where we otherwise might, because people are thinking along those lines. And so the odds are going to go up if we get more information. It's somewhat of a, self-feeding monster there. I mean, so but I think what you're really asking is what's my, how's this affecting my bottom line? Is it worth it for me to do this or not, right? I mean, yeah, I mean, I know that's the question for business. I mean, when I went through, the CISSP, prep and all that, I mean, it was clear, I was like, oh, geez, no one's going to call us the way this is being trained. I mean, and I understand the focus. And the message I want to leave all of you with that are in business here is that we do understand your motivations and your interests, and that you need to get this thing shut down. You need to get, the operation back up and running, and you want to get back in business. You've got, payroll to meet, et cetera, right? So we get that. And I said it before, but I want to say it again. Our goal is not to come in and take over your operations, take over your network, and massively slow down your response to this incident. We want to be a force multiplier to what it is that you're doing. We want to just make sure that we are collecting, and even if this is just in consultation over the phone, we want to make sure we're collecting the information we need so that we can do our long-term investigation. Otherwise, that stuff is going to get lost. So, you know, and we may be able to get information that is relevant to what you need to do to remediate and make notifications. Maybe we can figure something out with the intelligence we have, which will let you determine that it wasn't as bad as you initially thought it was. Maybe you don't need to make all the notifications that you thought you were going to. You know, I don't know, but there is some value to getting a hold of us, making sure we get what we need, and we're not going to come in and take things over and, you know, slow you down and disrupt your business unnecessarily.
In terms of remediation, I mean, I think there are a couple advantages of having gone to law enforcement. I think there's a reputational, I mean, you're going to have disgruntled customers, disgruntled somebody that you've been the victim of a data breach. There, I think, are reputational advantages to say we've done everything we can to fix it. We've worked with law enforcement. We hope we've successfully actually led to them being able to figure it out, prosecute someone, and convict them. And part of a conviction is in the federal system, courts can order restitution, which means if you lost $50,000 because you had to hire a firm to clean up, the court can order that this defendant pay that $50,000. Some of it's going to come out of the $100 a month he earns in jail earnings, so that's not going to make you very rich, but it's going to be a little satisfying. But also, people who've been doing cybercrime for a while have bank accounts filled with money, and we try to reach those and forfeit them. When we do, it goes to the victims. So there can be remediation too.
Two real quick last points. One is, I think we and our other speaker or co-speakers have made kind of an atmosphere of doom and gloom. We don't want to portray that. I mean, forums like this are important, and you can see that people are starting to think about this more and trying to get ahead of the problem. So yeah, there are a lot of bad people out there stealing IP and money and online child exploitation, but we are having successes, and we are putting people in jail, and we are indicting Chinese military officers, and that has a political effect. So there is some upside to this. The second thing, and I like to promote this often, is give the shout out to OTA, is they do have a data breach response guideline plan on their website, and Craig can talk about it, but it's a great thing to read. It's a great read. When I read it a couple years ago, I thought there's nothing like that out there, particularly for organizations like yourself. And you had mentioned earlier, how do I convince my leadership to think about this problem? That's a great resource.
Great. Well, I want to thank our panel here and our host here, and I think we'll be around for a little while to take any additional side questions. So thank you guys for your time.